with Mike, maybe this spring, or we'll see, God willing, what the situation is in Israel and America. People are willing to travel, so we'll see. But I want to thank you, Mike, I've gotten so many emails of people just saying what an amazing series this was and how much we appreciate it.
Well, my pleasure. And as I was telling you before we let everybody else on, Rabbi, or actually I was telling Hannah, it's nice that, we get these. A lot of times I'll do a session and people come and people go. But when we have a series of 6, it's nice for me to know that it's the same faces and I can build on the things I've talked about in previous weeks. So I thank you for the opportunity in advance of my last session. All right, we'll go right to the questions and answers then. No, I'm kidding.
All right, take it away. I'm going to turn off my camera. Okay.
Hello, everybody. I speak to you actually from the same time zone. There's good news. I'm actually in Vancouver, Canada, visiting my mom for a week, and it's the first time I've flown since February of 2020. It's different. There's a lot of bureaucracy involved, but I will tell you the reward of travel is just as fulfilling, physical travel, as it was before Corona started. So God willing, in the not too distant future, as the rabbi said, we will be able to do more physical travel, whether it's to visit grandkids or whoever, or to get on the plane, of course, and come to Israel in the not too distant future. But we're going to end our 6 series sessions today. What's going on here? Why did it do that? I don't know. We're going to end our, you can see my screen, yes? Good. We're going to end our series. What's happening here? Sorry, a second. The short history of Israel in 6 parts. All right, where's my screen going? I apologize here. Once I could, let me try this one more time. Here we go. Yes, this is last week. We talked about Gaza, just kind of in review, and we ended. The last 2 sessions are really the past 20 years, 2 decades, 1998, our 50th anniversary. And unfortunately, the past 20 years, I think, have been characterized a lot in the news by rockets from Gaza, issues with Lebanon we talked about. And now we're going to talk a lot in the last decade about politics, what's happening in Israel politically. And we're going to end up with, if we began last week with Startup Nation, the idea of Israel being this incredible anvil of creativity in high tech and in biotech and in fintech, financial technology, and now, of course, in cyber technology. And you've probably been reading a lot about what might be happening between Israel and Iran in terms of the cyber field. So Israel is renowned as this startup nation. And I will tell you, I'm in Canada now for a week, and I'm actually surprised when I speak to my friends here about how slow Canada is compared to what I'm used to in Israel, from medical records and testing and all sorts of things like that are electronically linked. Israel is way ahead, I think, of many, many other countries who have maybe even more resources, but it's a mindset that I think is in Israel. So our last image of the Tel Aviv skyline, Startup Nation, and ending, as I said, with me. That's me getting my first vaccine. The good news is I actually have a second vaccine. The Ministry of Health Policy in Israel is only vaccinate once those who have had corona. I had corona 13 months ago. And in order to come into Canada, and this is one of the challenges of travel, you will find out when you get in a plane soon, is that every country has its different criteria. And so to come to Canada, I needed a second vaccine, which I thankfully got on the 17th of October. We're going to go away from Mike for a bit, and we're going to go to what's happening in the north. Last week, I talked about the outbreak of the Arab Spring. I talked briefly how it began end of 2010, early 2011 in Tunisia, where a young man in the market had his stall overturned and arrested because he was, he didn't have the right permits in Tunisia, and it spreads across the Middle East. And there's no question that perhaps the greatest toll that the Arab Spring, the instability, which when one uses the word spring, the Prague Spring in 1968, we think positive. These are good things. They're moving toward positive change, renewal, rebirth. In Jewish tradition, of course, the spring Pesach is the holiday of the future Messianic era. In Christianity, it's the crucifixion of Jesus and the hope of the resurrection, the returning of Jesus, I should say, the second coming. And so when we use the word spring, there's some optimism. Unfortunately for Syrians, there's not a lot of optimism because as you see the map of Syria, there is up here. There is Israel just over there. There's the Golan Heights, and this all is Syria. Lebanon up over here. Syria goes all the way up to the Mediterranean. Latakia is a port where the Russians actually have some significant control. And again, without going into the detail of who's who, just look at the colors. The yellow are the Alawites, the minority of President Assad. The Sunni are the majority Muslims. And then there is a small percentage, the dark green, of Shia in a few major cities over here throughout Syria. And there's a civil war, a tragic civil war in which too many people have lost their lives, over 500,000, half the country are refugees. And the question, of course, is what does this mean for Israel? I'm always reminded of Prime Minister Menachem Begin. In the late 70s, he was elected in 77, you might remember. He was asked, what's Israel's position on the Iran-Iraq war? And his response was, we wish both sides the best of luck. Neither were our friends. We're not really involved in this. And let it finish when it finishes, as long as they're not focusing on us, he was thinking. What are the handful of Israeli policies vis-a-vis the Syrian civil war? Because distances is small, right? The distance from Damascus here to the border is about 40 miles, to put it in context. You can take an airplane, and if you cross the border from Syria, you're already in the Mediterranean Sea, way out over here, in maybe a minute and a half. Rockets take not that far. It's right next door. I mean, the distance between where people live in the Golan Heights and Damascus might be about the same distance, 40 miles, as some of you might have to travel from your house to your work. You live in the city, you commute out to the valley, or vice versa. So it's very close. Israel says, we're not going to take a position either side of the many sides, and we're not going to be dragged into the fighting. It's your civil war, work it out amongst yourselves. It's not our mishagas, as we say in Arabic. Secondly, the Israeli government has said very clearly, we will provide humanitarian aid, medical aid in cases to whoever comes to the border. We're not going to ask any questions. Somebody loses a limb, we will take care of them and then return them to Syria. Thousands of people have been treated. It's not happening anymore because the government controls much of the border area. But when at the height of the civil war, there were daily, sometimes dozens of people being brought and paid for by us Israeli taxpayers in hospitals across Israel. We will respond with any fire into Israel, either intentional or errant, by targeting the source. We will not accept refugees. Unfortunately, Israel is still in a war situation vis-a-vis Syria. And finally, we will make sure, and I say we, I mean the military. I mean, my son is still in the Air Force, but he plays a very small role in that. But make sure that there is no Iranian presence along the border, close to the border with Israel, and make sure there's no change to the status quo vis-a-vis Hezbollah, the Shia terror organization in Lebanon, who, as you remember, last week or 2 weeks ago, are actually part of the parliament and part of the Lebanese government. They are in many ways an Iranian proxy, Hezbollah. And if Israel believes that the Iranians are sending any supplies across Iraq, across Syria, into Lebanon that will change the status quo, for example, providing the technology to allow Hezbollah to have precision-guided missiles to Israeli population centers, Israel will respond. Hundreds of Air Force attacks have taken place in Israel, usually not assumed responsibility by Israel, or not claimed, but I should say, according to international press reports, assumed to be Israel responding in Syria. How bad is this refugee crisis? Look, Syria was a country before the civil war of about 24 million people. And to put it in context, about half of those people are refugees. So these circles represent the number of people, over 6 million refugees within Syria. Now, there's 1 out of every 4 Syrians are domestically displaced from their home. They live in homes, but now they've got to be in Damascus. Crazy. Imagine, 75 million Americans aren't able to live in their homes. So the people who live in the valley are living in the city. People in the city are living in Los Altos. It's crazy. An additional 6 million refugees have fled the country. To where? To Turkey, to Lebanon, to Jordan, to Iraq. Iraq? When people realize 250,000 Syrians have left Syria because of the civil war to get peace and quiet in Iraq, you realize how bad the situation is. And what about Lebanon? 1 million refugees in a kind of civilly divided society like Lebanon, which is on the verge of another civil war. That's about I think, 6 or 7 million Lebanese. So another 15, 18% of the population refugees. It is a crazy, crazy situation. We all know, of course, of Angela Merkel in Germany, who brought in refugees, over 1 million refugees, mostly from Syria, a few years ago. Look at the numbers. This is from an Israeli think tank, 500,000 killed. As I said, half of the 24 million people are either displaced or are, there it is, or are refugees outside of the country. About 30% of infrastructure destroyed, 90% live below the poverty line. It is a mess and it is a disaster. And it's been going on since 2011. And tragically, the world is really unable to do anything about it. I've been many, many times with groups to the border. We have a security briefing. And here's these are pictures from my phone, just to show you how close we are. Here you can see is the Untitled in Israel. Obviously, this is the fence. This is Syria. And you see the bus over there. Highlighted. That is a bus. This was maybe 3-4 years ago. We're having a small group having a briefing with the reserve security officer, and he was showing us and telling us what's going on. And I don't know if you can see, there's some smoke back in the distance. I can't see it on my computer. You probably won't be able to. But here's a bus taking people literally out of their homes, refugees in the process of becoming refugees, having to flee their home because of the fighting. And we're on the Israeli side of the fence. And the tragedy, of course, is that two things. One is this has nothing to do with the Arab-Israeli conflict. I talked in the previous 2 sessions in 1977. Sadat in November decides to come to Israel, the president of Egypt. Israel and Egypt with America and President Carter signed the Camp David Accords. Right? It's a totally different reality. 1993, the Oslo Accords with the Palestinians. 1994, the Peace with Jordan. Even negotiations with Syria. But there is no Arab-Israeli conflict. There are bilateral issues between Israel and our neighbors, direct neighbors like Syria, and our not so direct neighbors like the Emirates, Morocco, Bahrain, Sudan, all of whom, as we will see, are part of the new Abraham Accords. So Israel says, this is your Mishigas over there. It's got absolutely nothing to do with us. And the world can't do anything about it. The UN doesn't, they might have some kind of low-level condemnatory resolution passed, but if you look at how many resolutions have been passed in 10 years against Syria and the bloodletting and the loss of human life and limb, they're compared to all the UN declarations against Israel. You see the two totally different realities, unfortunately. Israel is constantly monitoring the border. You can see up over here, there is an Israeli military position, and here you can see the fence on the Israeli side, and there in the distance is Syria. And from the same place, more or less, this is the same town on the right here that you see in the distance over there. I just zoomed in. There is the fence. I could throw from where I was standing. I'm no longer a good baseball player, but I could have, at my height, thrown from center field and probably got the baseball over that fence to show you how close we are. Again, who's fighting who there? Just without going into the detail, just look at the colors, right? This majority of the country, the yellow is pretty much open desert space, but the white, is desert, but the pink is the area under the government or the allies, and all the others are different rebel forces. The Kurds over here in yellow, there's Turkey with a lot of military force here. Of course, the Russians are involved. Of course, the Iranians are involved. It is and continues to be a mess, to say the least. And in fact, just I added this slide, actually, because what's the date on see it here myself. On October 30th, on a Saturday afternoon, according to the Israeli newspaper, Israel is said to strike near Damascus in a rare daytime raid. Hundreds and hundreds of aerial attacks, as I said, by Israel. Oftentimes they're not admitted, but why is Israel attacking a base? It's probably because, as I mentioned earlier, one of those 5 policy priorities of Israel is to ensure that the civil war doesn't come into Israel, and secondly, to ensure that there is no change in status quo vis-a-vis Lebanon, and that Hezbollah does not root themselves deeper, that Iran doesn't have a stronger presence in that area as well. All of this continues to happen. Israel continues to monitor the border in a very, very tight, very strict tripwire kind of idea that something light can happen and it can escalate quickly. My youngest son in the Air Force last week said he was going for a training exercise somewhere up in the north, came home to get a heavy jacket. So Israel is constantly, we don't know, most of us, even in Israel, exactly what's going on, but always monitoring what's happening. In the midst of this, we started in 2013 to have a series of elections. And as a result of this election, 4 years after the election in 2019, Israelis went to vote. Netanyahu's party on the right over here ultimately got more votes than any other party. 31 of 120 seats, so a little bit more than a quarter of the popular vote. But at the same time, a brand new party started by this young man, he's 58 today, Yair Lapid, who was a journalist beforehand, called Yesh Atid. There is a future. And he collected a series of journalists and public figures and whatever business people, ethnically and religiously diverse, and had a new party from 0 to 19 seats in one election. Just to put that in context, right? If Netanyahu's party received 31, Lapid from nowhere, literally. Now, the strongest politician in Israel gets 25% of the vote, and he gets about 17% of the vote. Together with somebody else on the political right, a man named Naftali Bennett, our current prime minister, by the way. And what goes around comes around. Lapid on the center left here, and the leader Bennett of the right political party called the Jewish Home, who received 12 seats, together decided with their 31 that they would form a government with the prime minister under the condition that there are no Haredi ultra-Orthodox parties, and they would deal with the challenges I talked about last week that sparked the social protest in Israel in 2011. Ultimately, the government was sworn in the spring of 2013. At the same time, again, this is part of the humanitarian aid, as I was saying before, that Israel is giving. Here you can see to Syria. These are the Israeli flags, Red Cross in the middle, UN, and there you can see in the distance the Syrian flags. And look at just some of the numbers, right? How many people have been given medical care, thousands upon thousands, diapers, food, etc. And Israelis, it was amazing. I remember Israelis would be said, people want to give to the Syrians, but you've got to take off any tag that has any Hebrew in them, because they would reluctantly accept them, because they might be discovered to be wearing a shirt that says, Coca-Cola or something in Hebrew, and then walking in the streets of Damascus and shot because they're, collaborators with Israel. Complicated neighborhood. 2014, we come back to Gaza again, unfortunately. There was a major operation in Gaza, which emanated out of a kidnapping and ultimate murder of 3 Israeli teenagers who were studying at a yeshiva on the West Bank. Thursday afternoon, they were hitchhiking to try to get home, kidnapped. Israel tried to find them throughout the West Bank, cracked down on Hamas. And in response, Hamas said, we're going to shoot rockets at you. And they did. My eldest actually was in the military at the time, and he was involved in looking for the boys, as were thousands of others. Thankfully, not him, but his colleagues in another team in his very small unit found the boys. And ultimately, it was launched it became the longest continuous military operation Israel has ever had, originally from the air and then from the land. And I think that this operation was different than previous operations. For years, truly, it was very different, as I said, because our eldest son was involved. He spent pretty much that entire time in or next to the Gaza Strip as a medic in a small special ops unit connected with the paratrooper brigade. The second major difference was the presence of tunnels. This was already, 9 years ago? No, what am I talking? 7 years ago. We discovered almost 40 tunnels. Command tunnels we knew existed under Gaza for the leadership to hide. Smuggling tunnels we knew of from Egypt under the border into Gaza as well. But the new idea of these terror tunnels, 39 or so, discovered, basically dug under the sand. You remember last week, Gilad Shalit, the Israeli prisoner who was kidnapped, they had a tunnel beforehand, but we didn't know they had 39 of them, dug underneath to come out in a field or to come out next to an agricultural community, essentially to wreak havoc and spread terror. As I said, 50 days of fighting, the longest continuous combat in Israel's history. And for the first time, the center of the country, the major urban areas, and Ben Gurion Airport were targeted. In fact, when a rocket landed very, very close to Ben Gurion Airport, and you can see here, this is a sign that was put up back then. You can see run for shelter. This is the Ben Gurion symbol, the airport, where to run if you hear a siren. And airlines, as a rocket landed, and Iron Dome didn't intercept it. It landed about half a mile from Ben Gurion Airport. Many international airlines stopped flying to Israel for a few days. And from Hamas's point of view, they didn't kill anybody, but they wreaked tremendous havoc and damage on Israel and our international relations. And of course, that's an issue that we constantly are concerned with. You've got one major airport, and if that's closed down, because Hamas has the technology to shoot rockets there, it becomes a very, very big issue. It's like LAX is a pain, I know. But imagine if someone from Mexico was shooting rockets at LAX every once in a while just because they wanted California back, because you all know that California, I think, does rightfully belong to someone. Oh, sorry, I'm not going to go into that. Anyway, but that's the situation in this part of the world. In this war, July to August, our daughter, that's me on the left, that's our daughter, who's now 26, she was called up. She knew already 6 months in advance it was time for her to report for a 2-year military duty. In the midst of the rockets falling, we had to take her, my wife and I, to the induction center outside of Tel Aviv. And you can see there's a ceiling, a cement ceiling. It's thick, it's about a foot high, but it's outdoors. And when we got there, we heard, if there's a siren, please go inside to the protected space. Now, it wasn't really a shelter. It was just in a building where you're more protected than in the open space. But there were hundreds of people there. There wasn't enough space for everybody to go in. And lo and behold, as we're waiting with her, and she's very anxious, the sirens go off. We try to go inside. We can't. We basically stay where we are. And then we can hear, but we can't see, the thud of the outgoing iron domes. 9 o'clock Sunday morning, shoot at rush hour time in Tel Aviv. You don't, again, if you're Hamas, have to be accurate. You just need to make sure that 2 to 3 million people have hell on their hands, because they've got 90 seconds to find a safe place. And it might or might not land and damage someone. From Hamas's point of view, it's more about, as I say, terrorizing all of Israel. And of course, our son, he's an armored personnel carrier. They aren't allowed to have beards, but his grew quite a bit in 47 days while he was serving next to Gaza. There's a daughter. She comes home on her first day, and she was very nervous because her older brother was in the military, knowing he was next to Gaza. We were not worried about her because she was on a base training in the middle of nowhere in the desert, which really wasn't a target. And you ready for this? You might not remember, I have 3 kids, the youngest of whom is getting out of the Air Force. And this is his call-up notice for the military, and not to go into the military. But here it was, it said in the middle of the war, he got a notice that in November, he had to show up at the draft board. He was in 11th grade to begin all of his testing. So typical Israeli family. Still, kids are getting ready to go into the army, starting the army, and are in the midst of an operation inside of Gaza. Unfortunately, the number of rockets that Hamas and Islamic Jihad and other much smaller organizations that none of us have ever heard of were, quote, successful in launching thousands of rockets. 90%, 85 to 90% were saved by Iron Dome, that technology. The pictures that I showed you last week. I had a group, a delegation, I think from the New York area, solidarity with the New York Federation, and we went. And literally the morning that we were supposed to go down to the city of Ashkelon, this house was totally devastated with a much heavier rocket. Ashkelon is a very large city. Sorry, LA is a large city, but on Israeli standards, 150, 170,000 people. And this destroyed the rocket. While we were there, by the way, we had a siren, and we went into the basement of the shelter across the street. The town of Sderot, small little town, about 24,000 people. Last week, I might have showed you the pictures of where the guy was holding the rocket, and I had the blue and red arrows, if you remember, showing exactly where the border was. Lots and lots and lots of devastation. Unfortunately, human toll as well. This was a tragedy that happened to my son's unit. One of the teams, here's the team of the commander called Efron. You can see a very small team. Their faces are all blurred, but these 3 young men, unfortunately, were part of a group. This team, they were in a house. The outside of the house had a sign that said UN Medical Center, and they were in the house trying to find the terror/attack tunnels. And while they were waiting for their next move or for the engineering corps to come in, the house had been booby-trapped, and it blew up, and it killed, unfortunately, these 3 young men. And the dozen or so other members of the team were seriously wounded, some seriously and others moderately wounded, but they had to evacuate under fire this whole team that was in an ambush. So how do you deal with threats of rockets coming at you when they're embedded in the heart, in the center of civilian populations? As I mentioned last week, one of the more difficult challenges of Israel. The government of Lapid / Netanyahu / Bennett, March 2013, doesn't last that long. Ultimately, it collapses over budgetary issues, and Lapid is fired by Netanyahu. They then go to another election. In the spring of 2015, 2 years later, one of the big issues of contention, in addition to the financial issues, was the nation-state law. Israel defines itself as a Jewish and democratic state, but we live in that tension. Is it more Jewish? Is it more democratic? Do we sacrifice the sacred cow of democracy for the Jewish values? Do we sacrifice the sacred cow of Judaism for democratic values? And there are different answers amongst different Israelis. But this nation-state law tried to prioritize the Jewish character of Israel over the democratic character of Israel, and that led to a split in the government. After the election, Netanyahu again successfully cobbled together a right-wing and ultra-Orthodox coalition, literally 2 hours before the deadline. You have elections, and then you have, I think it's 2 months, or 3 months maybe. The prime minister has to try to form a government. If not, then somebody else would be given that opportunity, or we could go to elections. And this new government, already the old government, 13 to 15, was discussing this nation-state law. But in 2018, in July, the law was approved by the Knesset, defining Israel as, I quote, the national home of the Jewish people, which it is, in which it fulfills its natural, cultural, religious, and historical right to self-determination. Read our foundational document, the Declaration of Independence. It says the exact same thing, but by doing things such as declaring the state's language as Hebrew, which it was beforehand, together with Arabic. There were two official state languages, Hebrew and Arabic. And the new law says that the language is Hebrew. The Arabic language has a special status in the state regarding the use of Arabic in state institutions or by them will be set in law, regulating. In other words, we are prioritizing the Jewish character over the democratic character. And this caused a lot of tension, both in the center left in Israel and, of course, and I include in that the Israeli Arab population. 1 out of every 5 Israelis speak Arabic. And that is one of the challenges that Israel had with that law, and of course will continue to have for a long time. And I always say, we were people without power for 2 millennia, and one of our most significant commandments is the notion of remembrance. And one of the main remembrances in Jewish tradition is that we should remember that we were strangers in Egypt. And that experience of being a subjugated minority, or not subjugated, but a minority, should allow us to understand a little bit better the reality in which we find ourselves. 2018, the government is formed. A little bit before that, the man who lived at the White House for 4 years recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. I should say that already either under Carter or under Reagan, I don't remember, I think it might have been Reagan, the Congress passed a resolution calling for the moving of the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And every president, I think 3 or 6 months, issues a presidential emergency order overriding that and postponing it. But President Trump said the following in December of 2017. I have determined that it's time to officially recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. It was 70 years ago that the U.S. under President Truman recognized the state. Ever since then, Israel has made its capital in the city of Jerusalem. True. The capital of the Jewish people established in ancient times. Today, Jerusalem is the seat of the modern Israeli government. It's the home of the Israeli parliament, Knesset, as well as the Supreme Court, the official location, the official residence of the prime minister and the president, and headquarters of many government ministries. So far, nobody would disagree. But today, he continued, we finally acknowledge the obvious, that Jerusalem is Israel's capital. This is nothing more or less than a recognition of reality. It's the right thing to do. It's something that has to be done. That is why, consistent with that law, the American Embassy Act, I'm also directing the State Department to begin preparation to move the American Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And he did. He made the declaration in December, and by May, on the non-Hebrew calendar date of the anniversary of Israel, which, by the way, is a date that the Palestinians mark as the Nakba Day, the day of the tragedy or the catastrophe. You might remember in my second session a month ago, I talked about that. Our War of Independence they see as the catastrophe when their land was stolen from them by us, and that there were lots of protests, some connected to the embassy, but largely just over the existence of Israel on May 14th. And I don't know how many you remember watching back home, but on one side of the screen you saw these images of the convoys going up to the embassy, of the American ambassador there opening the embassy. On the other half of the screen, you saw what was happening with this massive, what was called the March of Return by Palestinians from Gaza. Now, I asked myself, March of Return, they're in Gaza. Israel's not in Gaza. We're next to Gaza, and Egypt is next to Gaza. So where are they going to return to? Many Israelis continue to ask themselves. And I think, and I mentioned already last week, that with the Intifada starting, particularly the second one in fall of 2000, many Israelis began to realize that Palestinian unrest doesn't have to do with the occupation of 1967 of the West Bank and Gaza, but rather it's to do with the occupation of Israel, period. Its very existence here. And I think that was what that march was in May of, that was what that Palestinian March of Return was in May, the same day the embassy opened. We recognize her as the embassy was opening. I had a group of people from the States who came shortly thereafter. And of course, they're very happy with the embassy. And I think that this, my friend here, Skip, I think that in many ways, this image here is very telling. A lot of us might say it's the right thing. The embassy should be in Jerusalem. It is the capital. It's absurd that the embassies aren't there, but the prime minister is there. So a head of state and government comes and stays in the King David Hotel in Jerusalem and visits the prime minister in Jerusalem and the president and addresses the parliament. So why isn't it our capital? But it's a political hot potato. The Palestinians and the rest of the Arab and Islamic world say you shouldn't have the embassy there until there is a final agreement between Israel and the Palestinians. So here we've got a prime minister, Netanyahu, elected, and he is elected in 2013. He's elected again in 2015. He's got the backing of an American president, a very strong relationship between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump, of course. And the embassy, what better proof of the success of our prime minister, some would interpret it, that he was able to finally get recognition of Jerusalem as the capital. I think 2 other countries ever since then in Central America have moved their embassies to Jerusalem. But that didn't necessarily help. The government lasted. We go to elections in April 2019. And I put this picture up there. That's me, of course, my daughter, our daughter, and my wife, Michelle. And we're holding pieces of paper. I put this picture there because I didn't know there were going to be a number of elections in 4 elections in 2 years. But how does voting work in Israel? Everyone has an ID number they get when they're born. When they're 16, they get a photo ID piece of card. And then based on that and your address, you get a month or 2 before the election, a little piece of paper that says, here is where you're going to vote. You take the paper, you take your ID card, and they check to see who you are. They cross out the line on the paper, and then you vote. There's no registration. It's all automatic. In other words, if I live in Israel now and I move to Canada tomorrow, and there's an election next year, I will get a letter to my old address telling me that I'm voting. And so it's a very, very high voter turnout because it's based on people who are in Israel on election day. And if you're not in Israel, you can't vote. So even if there are 9.3 million people living in Israel, it's possible there may be 500,000 people traveling or doing a PhD at Stanford or UCLA and aren't there. They're counted as those people who are not voting. It's bizarre, but I digress. That's for another time. When we vote, this is a list of all the political parties running. You go into the ballot booth and you'll see it in just a moment. There's another picture here. You'll see this is the second election we had. So, right, the first election we had in April, inconclusive results. Nobody could form a government. We go to the ballot box in September. And if you see the difference, the number of letters here, right, these are all political parties. So this is Emet, which is the Labour Party. This is Likud, the Likud Party. So we had, I think, 25 parties here. But look at this list there. You see many more parties running. 25 to 35, 40 parties run in an election. Inconclusive in April. Inconclusive in September. That's me. Oh, so I walk in and there's the person. I show them my card and my ID card. They give me an envelope. I go back behind this cardboard booth here. I pick out one of the letters from one of the parties that I know, and you can see it's written in Hebrew and in Arabic. And then you put it in the envelope and they put it in the box and they count it. No hanging chads, nothing. It is about as low tech as possible, but it works. And the people who print all these pieces of paper did very well because we had so many elections. So we've got a second election in a few months, inconclusive September 2019. But in January, as the prime minister is still the caretaker prime minister, right? The government is still the government. We still are holding over until there are new elections. And in January of 2020, the American administration issues this plan, what I call 2020 hindsight, the peace to prosperity, the vision to improve the lives of the Palestinian and Israeli people. It was rejected by two main groups, the Palestinians, who didn't even show up for the launching, and the Jews who lived in Judea, Samaria, the West Bank, the settler organization. Why? Because the Palestinians, they said, all this dark color is Palestine. We don't want this empty desert down over here. We want Gaza and we want 100% of the West Bank. You're creating these, small little enclaves, and we're only getting 70%, 60%, whatever the number was, of the West Bank. And so they were opposed to that. And what about the Jewish settlements? It's hard to see, but there are Jewish settlements in here. All these red dots, these small little red dots, are all Jewish settlements, which would stay surrounded 359 degrees or so by a Palestinian state. And that's why the Jews and the far-right settlement organization were opposed to it, because it called for the creation of the state of Palestine. So President Trump launches this audacious plan, and we've got a prime minister. We've got a lot of support of the American administration. The embassy has moved in May of 2018. This new plan in January of 2020. But when we go to elections for a third time in less than a year, in March of 2020, that's my wife. It's a bit colder. You can see we were wearing shorts and T-shirts then. There she's casting her ballot, and there I am casting my ballot. Same room, same place, same school, same no clear winner after the elections. And so here we can see, it should be the other way around, but right is generally red and left is blue, but whatever. Maybe socialist right here. But the right political parties, the bloc led by Netanyahu, whose party got 36 seats, altogether had 58 seats. The political center left, led by this man, Kachol Lavan, the leader of this party, Benny Gantz, had 33 seats, and neither of them could form a coalition. At the last minute, literally, the last minute, Gantz on the left-hand side said, you know what? It's 2020. We've got something called Corona. We need a national emergency government. And he decided to join Netanyahu, but he paid a heavy price. Look, his party, which was actually made up of three parties, had 33 seats, almost the same as Likud. He formed an agreement with Netanyahu, but he lost. We'll see in a moment, I forget the numbers. He lost. He went from 33 seats, you can see, to 15. In other words, 18 of the seats that were with him in the election on the list went over here and split and said, we cannot sit in government with Netanyahu. You're selling your soul to the devil. You ran 3 times Mr. Gantz, there he is, on a ticket saying you'll do anything, but you will refuse to sit in governance with Prime Minister who's under indictment and investigation, and now, as I speak, on trial in 3 separate cases. No, we're out of here. And they left. And the government was supposed to last for 3 years, and it was going to be a power-sharing agreement where Netanyahu would be prime minister, and then in the fall of 2021 now, Gantz would become prime minister. Unfortunately, that lasted until about December of 2020 over a budgetary issue. Essentially, the prime minister refused to pass the budget, Netanyahu, and the government fell, and we went to new elections once again in March, which we'll come back to. So far, 3 elections, 2019, 2020, all pretty inconclusive. We've got the January 2020 launching of this peace prosperity plan, and then in the summer, we've got this brand new bombshell, this unbelievable Abraham Accords. U.S., Israel, Emirates sign, Bahrain later joins shortly thereafter. They come to the White House September 15th. I don't know if you remember, but it was September 13th, 1993, that Arafat and Rabin shook hands on the White House lawn. And then the governments and then the parliaments ratify this agreement. Later on, the president of Sudan meets with the prime minister, and they agree to normalization. We don't know what's happening because they're mired in conflict as we speak. The prime minister said, this is a new era, an era of peace, a peace that is expanding with other Arab countries, 3 of them in recent weeks. And part of the quid pro quo was that the United States removed Sudan from the state sponsors of terror list. It's a complicated world we live in. And finally, toward the end of 2020, Morocco and Israel announced an agreement as well. Who's next? Oman, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar. We do not know. We also signed an agreement with the Bhutan, which is not an Arab or Islamic country. It's somewhere off in Asia near Mongolia, but whatever. All of this happening in literally, you open the newspaper, another day, another agreement. Why did the Emirates agree? Finally, to normalize relations with Israel? Was it because your government agreed to sell the most sophisticated airplanes to the Emirates, which is good for business in America? $23 billion is nice for the economy. There are lots of factors. Why would they agree to not yet solve the Palestinian issue? I remember in the 70s and early 80s, Sadat was criticized, and then in the 90s, King Hussein of Jordan. How can you sign his Arab and Islamic countrymen, or other countries' leaders would say, how can you sign a deal with the devil, with the Zionist enemy, until you resolve the Palestinian conflict? And that's why I say there really is no there's no more Israeli-Arab conflict. They're bilateral conflicts. There's an Israeli-Palestinian conflict, trying to figure it out there, and they're different issues. And the Emirates, I believe, and a good friend of ours was the interim ambassador for about 6 months in the Emirates. He's now the ambassador designated to Bahrain. And I was talking with him, and he said and he had been the former ambassador to Turkey. He said, diplomacy is all about interests. I said, how were you the ambassador to Turkey until he was kicked out by Erdogan? It wasn't him, it was Israel was kicked out. And he said, it's all about interests. Even in the cold era of Israel-Turkey relations in the past decade, trade increased more and more. And the people in the economic sphere don't necessarily agree with the ideological, theological leadership. Same too with the Emirates. A very pragmatic monarchy, high levels of education, a lot of cash to invest in a lot of areas that Israel offers. And if we can share health expertise, we can share cyber tech expertise. If by signing an agreement, I use the Bahraini Minister of Foreign Affairs, I think, and the Prime Minister of the Emirates over there, President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu. If we can sign an agreement brokered by the US, we can get better protection, not only from the weapon systems of the United States, but also from a stronger relationship with the United States and with a even better relationship with Israel. Now, why is all that important? If you look at the map of the Middle East, there's little Israel. Right? We've got peace with Egypt, 79, Jordan, 1994. Now the Emirates over here. Now little Bahrain over here. But notice where the Emirates are, right across the Arabian Sea. This is Iran. Iran, I remind you, is public enemy number one. Not just in the Middle East, but most of us would probably, maybe North Korea is kind of up there. It depends if you're asking Dennis Rodman or not, but right up there. But the problem is the difference between North Korea and Iran is that Iran is funding all sorts of instability across the Middle East, right? Funding and what's going the chaos in Iraq and in Syria and in Lebanon, and as a Shia as the Shia regime over here, almost everyone else is Sunni. A lot of kind of inter-Islamic tension going on, and literally you could swim from the Emirates across here to get to Iran. So the peace was not just about, hey, we want to foster relations with Israel because Emiratis want to go sit on the beach in Tel Aviv. It's also recognizing that this is good in terms of their protection and their security in this crazy Middle East. But interestingly enough, in the days that the Abrahamic Agreement was announced, look at this newspaper in London, published in London, but here it's printed in Bahrain. You see the headline in the newspaper, Israel freezes Palestine annexation for UAE ties. So the spin in the Emirates was that, hey, don't come telling us that we've sold out to the devil by making a peace agreement with Israel. Without solving the Palestinian issue. You might not remember, but in January, when the Prime Minister signed this, or was, when President Trump declared this new what do you want to call it? The new Abrahamic, the new plan for the Middle East. Prime Minister Netanyahu said he was going to annex the West Bank, and guess what? We stopped him from doing that. That was one of the quid pro quos. So we are still going to bat for the Palestinian issue. Notice again the dark colors. Who we have official relations with. We have unofficial with Sudan and Saudi Arabia and Oman, of course, and Qatar. God willing, we'll get there relatively soon with them. Same map, don't worry about that. I might put too many maps up here. Anyway, later on that year, early next year actually, in 24th of January, less than a year ago, Prime Minister Netanyahu announces now we've got normal ties with Morocco. And that's important because Morocco and the Maghreb in West Africa is the country where up until the immigration from the former Soviet Union that I talked briefly about 2 weeks ago and a little last week, the largest ethnic group of Jews in Israel are of Moroccan origin. And to allow people to go back to visit their relatives in Morocco, direct flights now between Israel and Morocco, or to visit graves of parents and grandparents buried there. There are, I think, 20,000 Jews in Morocco. Big deal. And so, as it was announced on the walls of the old city in Jerusalem, images projected, light images of the Israeli flag next to the Morocco flag. So now we've got the Emirates and Bahrain and Morocco publicly signing. Oh, what did I do there? Sorry about that one here. Don't allow. Sorry about this. All allowing. Yeah, resume share. Sorry. All allowing relations with Israel publicly and allowing Israelis to come visit and vice versa. There's my buddy Eitan, who in January was appointed the ambassador, and he went to basically set up and establish an embassy. And there are many, many Israelis. When I flew to Vancouver last week via Chicago at Ben Gurion Airport, the flight next to me was Emirati Air, people going to the Emirates for vacation, hundreds of thousands. No smaller than that of Israelis have gone, Israeli Arabs, Israeli Jews have gone to the Emirates for vacation, for weddings. You can now get kosher food in hotels there. It's pretty amazing. All of this great stuff is happening. I mean, great stuff. You know, Camp David, we all remember, Sadat goes to Jerusalem. Wow. Peace with the Arafat and Rabin shaking hands, 93. Wow. King Hussein making peace with Rabin, 94. Wow. And then you got 3 and maybe more agreements every week, every month happening. Fantastic. But yet, Israelis, 3 times, in the midst of all of this, the embassy moving in 2018, in the midst of all of this, Israelis still went to the polls now, soon for a 4th time, with inconclusive results. Massive protests in Jerusalem, here, outside the prime minister's residence a block away, essentially saying, how can you, Mr. Netanyahu, continue to be prime minister when you're in court, or your lawyers are in court, over 3 cases? Step aside. And what's incredible is in the elections, there were still people who voted more for Netanyahu than anybody else. Why? Look, Israel was the first country, thanks to the relationship, according to the prime minister's narrative, there he is, getting the first vaccine on December 19th, 2020, almost a year ago, thanks to what he claims his personal relationship with Mr. Burla, the CEO of Pfizer. Israel became a lab for Pfizer vaccinations, and very quickly a vaccination campaign took hold, ahead of really any country in the world. I think it had more perhaps to do with Pfizer saying, here, we've got a closed environment, 9.3 million people, 4 medical organizations, easily accessible, community health, not a problem. But whatever. We started in December, and then one of the satirists in the newspaper had a picture of King Bibi, a la the Game of Thrones over here, and his crown is all of these syringes. And the only airplanes coming in, can see the symbol of Pfizer. All the stores are closed. The economy is shut down. People like me, still, tourists weren't allowed in. Planes coming, planes going to bring down doses. Now, if you would land from Mars and you were to say, wow, look what's happened. The world's in crisis. Corona, economic, health issues. We haven't had anything like this in 100 years. And here's this little country, Israel, signing new peace agreements with 3 former enemy states, that is at the forefront of leadership in the world in terms of vaccinations. And Israelis go to the ballot in March 23rd. And guess what? It's our 4th election in 2 years. And here you can see, where is the sign over here for the Likud? This is the Likud symbol. This is the Labour Party symbol. And guess what? The results are inconclusive once again. Netanyahu's party, Likud, gets more votes than anybody else, but he is unable to form a government. And what happens? It's still not a government in March 23rd. And in the midst of all of this attempt to try to form a government, there is another escalation in Gaza. This is now the 4th round of violence in about 8 years, in Gaza. And we've got rockets coming again across Israel. Just a few months ago, I'll never forget, one day I was watching the news, and here's this young lady on TV. Her name is Or Bar Ilan. It's a screenshot I took from my TV. And as she's talking, and she's a journalist, and she lives in a kibbutz adjacent to the Gaza Strip. And there she was in Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, wherever the studio is, the national TV station, talking about the challenges of living in a place where, if you're lucky, you have 15 seconds from the moment you hear a siren and the rockets are launched to get into a protected space. But oftentimes, the rocket actually lands before the siren goes off, because you are adjacent to the Gaza Strip. And what have we here? This young lady is talking about life and the stresses in her late 20s, and all of a sudden, a sign pops up on the TV screen from the Home Command that says there is an announcement from the Home Front Command that there are rockets in Kfar Aza and in Nachal Oz. This young lady, lives on this kibbutz. In the middle of her talking, the interviewer says, "Oh, and those of you who live here, please get into a safe spot." And she says, "For my friends who are there, be safe. Do me a favor when the all clear goes, go back and check on my dogs because I know they're terrified every time they hear the siren and I'm not there. Make sure that they're okay." It's just crazy, that reality. And it just struck me how unusual, quote, life as normal goes on. My kids, my son and daughter-in-law were in Tel Aviv for dinner when the rockets first were launched toward Tel Aviv. And I heard the sirens and I texted him, and finally 5 minutes later he calls me and he says, "We're okay. We're in a restaurant sitting outside," and we went into the kitchen. Everybody did. There's no protected space there, but you're better inside a kitchen than out in clear view. And he said, "When you get a chance, Dad, can you go to our house and take out our dog?" And I'm like, "You should get home and take out your dog," because there was another siren about an hour or so later. So the crazy reality all over Israel. And for those who live like where I live in the center, or in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, we didn't have that many rockets. And we had a minute and a half, up to a minute and a half, to find a safe space. People like Or, who live adjacent to the Gaza Strip, have seconds to find safe space. And this picture, which many of you probably remember, I think is very telling of what the neighborhood is like. On the one hand, you've got rockets shot, and look at how many dozens are being shot at the same time. They're not precision rockets. Some are low tech, but they're shot from maybe even mobile batteries. And they're shooting toward Israel. And this is a picture taken from in Gaza. And in the distance, you see from 2 batteries of Iron Dome, fewer, but a number of Iron Dome interceptor rockets are sent out. Now, they go up into the sky. They're trying to figure out what's happening. The radar is telling them that this, based on this one rocket, for example, its velocity, the parabola of where it's going to land. And this rocket then, hypothetically, will then search toward it and circle around it and explode itself when it's in close proximity to the rocket coming in from Gaza with a 90% accuracy. It won't actually hit rocket to rocket. It blows it up within a few feet or something, and all the shrapnel from both rockets fall down. 90% success rate. Look, if you get a hit in baseball, 3 out of every 10 times, sorry to say this, you Dodger fans or Angel fans, but the World Series is over. But if you get a hit 3 out of every 10 times you're at bat, you're a Hall of Famer. You're batting .333. To hit 900 at something that is going a lot faster than a pitcher can throw a 100-mile-an-hour speedball, you understand the miraculousness of Iron Dome. You understand how Iron Dome isn't just a lifesaver for Israelis, but also for Palestinians. Why do I mean that? Because if one of these rockets were to land and hit a school or a hospital or a home and kill a dozen or 2 dozen or ever been more people, it would go crazy. The escalation would increase instantaneously, and there would be a lot more loss of life on the Palestinian side as well as on the Israeli side. And so when we hear, not that long ago, questions in American Congress over whether or not the American taxpayer should continue to fund Iron Dome, you understand it's not just that it saves Israeli lives, it saves Palestinian lives, and it's technology that continues to develop that ultimately might save American lives in the not too distant future. A lot of technology sharing happening. And here's another picture, sorry, you can see it over here, of what happens. Here's the rocket, right? In its straight trajectory. And over here, it's incredible pictures. I didn't take these, clarify. Here's the Iron Dome rocket, and then it literally makes a 180-degree turn and explodes in proximity to the rocket coming in from Gaza. It is unbelievable technology. I'm in the midst of all this. I had to go to take a doctor's appointment for a blood test or whatever, and I walked into the elevator, and outside the elevator were 2 signs. On one side, it said, wear your mask, 2 meters, all the precautions for Corona. And on the other side, it said, okay, this is Israel. Any of the red zones, if you hear a siren, you're close to the border with Lebanon, and you've got instantaneously, you got to find cover, or the lighter red, 15 seconds, right? I live over here. We've got a minute and a half in order to go for cover. Crazy. That's the reality that we live in when there's escalation, but knowing that escalation can happen at any moment. In the midst of all of this, there are a few solidarity delegations. This is a group I guided from the New York Jewish Federation. And here we were outside of an Iron Dome battery. See these young ladies over here? This woman on the left is the one in charge. Seriously, she's their commander. She's not even an officer. And you can see a couple more guys over here. Their job basically is to protect this. They don't press the button. Somebody else in headquarters, somewhere else. It's like the drones that operate in the drone operators who sit in Arizona. They operate the drones in Iraq and in Afghanistan. Same thing in Israel. And it's incredible to think it's seconds for the radar to detect a launch of a rocket, and then a few seconds for them to press the button. We've got a war. We've got corona vaccinations widespread. We've got lots of good things happening, the Abraham Accords. We go to elections. Netanyahu isn't able to form a government. He returns the mandate back to the president. And then, nothing short of miraculous, a government, the largest, the most diverse government ever is formed in Israel, with a total of 8 political parties. From the right, far right of Naftali Bennett's party, our prime minister, to the center left of Yair Lapid, who is the foreign minister, and he will be prime minister in the fall, I think, of 2022, and Mansour Abbas, the leader of an Islamist party. I don't know of any other democratic countries in the world who has an Islamist party as part of the democratically elected government, but we do. Here's their agreement that was signed. A lot of compromise, and ultimately these 3 leaders and the other 5 of the other parties said, listen, we have much more in common than we have that separates us. We've got crises on our hand. We don't have a budget for 3 years because the government was an acting interim government, wasn't able to pass to legislate a budget. We've got to do things that are absolutely necessary to ensure that we can move forward in the future. And if it means compromising part of my ideological platform upon which I sold to my voters who supported me, I need to do so to form this government. Unprecedented. And I think it's still in power. We're 5 months in, which is fantastic. But I think in many ways it's telling to many other democracies, particularly your democracy, where for the past 20, 25 years, people look at things of either blue or red state or county or whatever, and the bifurcation of American politics, I think, leads to a lot of issues in America, or maybe is symptomatic of a lot of issues in America. And in Israel, we had a situation where in those 4 elections, it was either you're with Netanyahu or you're opposed to Netanyahu. It's what I refer to as a very Shakespearean question. To Bibi or not to Bibi, right? You either vote for a party that's going to support him, and all of these leaders and the other 5 said, we'll do whatever is necessary, and the state of emergency we're in right now, except have a government with Netanyahu. And a lot of people said you can't do that. Interestingly enough, the political right, who wasn't part of the coalition, Netanyahu, said, how can you sign an agreement? He's an Islamist ideological party. And he himself said, Mr. Prime Minister Netanyahu, you were the one who reached out to me, because Netanyahu tried to get Mr. Abbas's political party to be a part of government, and he did not succeed. So Abbas said to Netanyahu, you were the one who reached out to me. You're the first Israeli leader in 70 plus years to go to the leader of an Arab party and say, join my government. And now you're questioning the legitimacy of the current government because it rests on the 5 votes of the Arab Islamist party? No, thank you, Mr. Netanyahu. So we got a government, we got a budget. There is the Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett. It's bizarre, by the way, because Bennett's party had 6 seats. That is 1/20th. 5% of Israelis voted for him. But again, we vote for representation in parliament, and then a coalition is formed. And in this case, we voted for various parties, 8 of whom joined together. Lapid on the right, it should be the other way around, but whatever, the foreign minister and soon to be the prime minister. Here you see the 8 members. Only one is a woman, Merav Michaeli. She is the head of the Labour Party. Benny Gantz, the head of Blue and White. Nitzan Horowitz, one of the first publicly open gay members of parliament, the second actually publicly gay minister from the far left Meretz party, Lieberman from the far right, finance minister, Bennett over here, Lapid over here, and Sarah over here. And interesting, all these 4 people have been close to Netanyahu and in government with Netanyahu, and all lead parties that say anything but Netanyahu. I talked about Startup Nation. I don't know how many of you are bike riders, but if you do, Israel has a bike team. It's a corporate team. Obviously, it's not a national team, called the Israel Startup Nation, funded almost exclusively by an Israeli billionaire, Sylvan Adams. And in the last Tour de France, This man, Tony Martin, who was, I think, Irish or Welsh, a bike rider, personal bike rider, won a stage in the Tour de France. And here he is wearing his Israel Startup Nation. And what's amazing is that these young men are all Israeli world-class bike riders. For the first time last year, an Israeli, Guy Neve, actually won, was in the Tour de France. And another Israeli bike rider, my youngest is a crazy bike rider from our town, believe it or not, won a stage in, I don't know, the Bulgarian or some other world-renowned bike ride not that long ago. Why is Israel still here? Why is Israel still thriving in the midst of this crazy neighborhood? I think this is an answer. This is from the website of Startup Nation Finder. There are over 6,400 startup companies. In Israel, we're 45 times your size, so multiply that by 45. In real terms, we're only behind the United States, real terms, not per capita, of startup companies. 377 hubs, incubators where people come together to try to take their ideas forward. Almost 400 multinational corporations from Google and Intel and Amazon. One nephew works for Amazon, another one works for Intel in Israel, investing in research and development because of the rich human capital that is here. And all I can say is life, remember that old Irma Bombeck book, If Life is a Bowl of Cherries, What Am I Doing in the Pit? Well, in the late summer, my wife and I went up to the Golan Heights, and there we are picking, eating cherries along the way. That's us. And all I can say is that hopefully that notion of life being a bowl of cherries will once again come back, and we'll all be able to meet face to face, not necessarily through virtual travel, and we'll all feel more comfortable about getting up. But until then, I hope you've enjoyed my very quick 6-session on everything you've always wanted to know about Israeli history and were afraid to ask. And with that, I'm going to pull down the blind so you can see my face clear and turn it over to you, Rabbi, for questions.
That was incredible. And let me see if there are questions. Hold on, because I'm in my chat. Hold on. Let's see.
There are statements which are nice.
Why are there no absentee ballots? I also was thinking, in such an advanced technological country, why can't you vote, online or something?
It's a great question. I don't know. I don't think there ever was an issue in the early years of Israel. People weren't traveling abroad. Not only, look, you have to take that card. You have to go into your voting station on the actual day. And not only are there no absentee ballots, but for example, I'm a tour guide, and there were times in the first election in March 3rd or whatever, 2020, I was guiding. And I told the people, instead of picking you up at 9:30, I got to come at 10 or whatever, because I had to go first at 7:30 to my ballot station. I couldn't vote somewhere else in the country. So you have to actually be in your station, unless you're in the hospital, you're in the Merchant Marine, or you're a soldier. And soldiers all vote on their base. My son, who's a soldier, voted 4 times, crazy, 4 times in 2 years, either in the field or on the base. But unless you're a diplomat working abroad, you cannot vote. We don't have that. And what's amazing is that the voter list includes people who are spending 5 years at UCLA doing a postdoc. But unless they're actually in Tel Aviv at the voting station, they can't vote that day. So when Israeli numbers come out, 75% voter turnout, it's based on the list of potential voters. And there may be 5 or 7 or 10% of Israelis who are abroad at any given. There's a big debate. Can we have an election in the summer? And the left never agrees, because there's a lot of people who go abroad, and they're more center-left people of more upper middle class means who will be abroad in the summer, and therefore we never have elections in the summer, because you can't vote in advance either, and you can't vote absentee ballots. Just the way it is.
But you mentioned the hospital. If you're in the hospital, you can vote?
Correct.
Okay, well, speaking of hospital, you talked so much about all of this bombing and all the Iron Dome and all the attacks. So what's the level of mental health in Israel? I mean, what's are there a lot of people with psychological problems and things?
It's a great question. I mean, there are a couple ways of looking at it. One is the good news. It's called the UN Happiness Scale. Every year the UN publishes, based on a number of criterion happening. Israel's like top 12 every single year. I hate to tell you, but America is like 33rd or something like that. We live longer than almost every country in the world except Japan, men and women. Much higher than America. You're, I think, 50th on the list. Canada does pretty well on that. So you say to yourself, oh, things are good on the one hand. On the other hand, you live in an environment where you can have a rocket at any moment, where you raise kids who are in life-threatening situations and you don't even know what's going on. We bring kids into the world to protect them, and then all of a sudden we send them out to protect the country. It's crazy. But there is PTSD, obviously, and there is a growing awareness that it's there. What people after the First World War called, in our grandparents' generation, oh, they were shell-shocked. Well, we now call that PTSD. Soldiers have it, unfortunately, and it's talked about. And around Memorial Day, and a couple times a year, you hear public service announcements. If you're waking up at night and you're sweating and you're having a nightmare, call this 1-800 number. But when you go to visit communities around Gaza, and you say, well, how do the children deal with that? They all, how many of them have PTSD? And they say, nobody. I said, nobody's PTSD. He said, yeah, there is no P in traumatic stress disorder around here because it's there all the time. You never get over it. You live in an environment where every kid, every time they leave their house, if they live within 5 miles of Gaza, knows they need to look for the shelter, knows that they need to make sure that there's a safe place for them to go to. So there's a lot of it in different places, and there's a lot talked about. I'll give you another personal story. My youngest son, he's a medic in the Air Force Search and Rescue Unit of the Air Force. It's the equivalent of the PJs, I think they're called in the United States Air Force. Very small unit. And their job primarily is search and rescue pilots who are downed outside of Israel. I don't know of anything that's happened in his 4 years of service, thankfully, beyond the borders. Who knows? But in Israel, they're also the preeminent search and rescue unit, helicopter-based search and rescue unit. So if some hikers get lost in the desert and dehydrate or drown and a boat capsizes, they've got to go in and get them. And I know he's had a couple instances where he's had to deal with situations, doing CPR on a teenager who doesn't make it. And that's not easy for a 21, 22-year-old kid. And so he said, yeah, they have a psychologist in the unit. If there's ever a major incident that they have to deal with, they will either come in and debrief them. So there's a lot greater awareness in the military in particular of the importance of mental health. And I think that Israel is a society. Look, I've been there 33 years, not quite half of Israel's history, and it's a changed society. And there's a lot more awareness of sensitivity to those emotional issues. Who had a therapist in the 1980s in Israel? But it's much more normative than it ever was before. And you're right, Rabbi, there's a lot of issue connected to terrorism and fear and rockets, and of course service in the military. So it's a changed place.
But I wonder, because Israel is such a macho community, culture, let's be honest, even though women are macho.
You haven't had wife or daughter yet. What are you saying?
Is there a stigma? I can't believe there isn't a stigma to admitting you need to go to a shrink. You need to go. I wonder.
No, I'm saying it's changed. It's changed quite a bit. There's no question. I mean, the fact that in the military they've always had, but it's much more accepted. I don't know if any stigma. I mean, I was talking to my son today, and a daughter-in-law, they're moving to Tel Aviv, and he said, "How's it going?" We went to the psychiatrist yesterday. He said, for the dog. So the fact that Israelis are actually spending money, she's very scared. I mean, I don't know. That's why he wanted me to go get her. As you remember, when the siren went off, she's petrified, and she has fear from somewhere. And the fact that there are dog there, I mean, I'm all joking aside, I love pets as well. But the fact that exists in Israel, I don't think that existed 20 years ago.
No.
People commonly go to therapy. So there is a continued concern, but there's also an awareness. Look at TV. The issues the shows that come on TV, some of you have seen Fauda, some of you have seen Tehran. Tehran's crazy, particularly as given what I told you what my son does, there are, lots of implications in those shows. There's also a show called The Valley of Tears. I don't know if you've seen that.
Yeah, I couldn't watch it. It's too tough.
I didn't watch it either, Rabbi, but that is very popular in Israel. And It's essentially a show about trauma from the Yom Kippur War in 1973. So the fact that that has popular reviews in Israeli society, I think, is indicative of how the, quote, machismo of Israel has changed. Number one. Number two, you remember my first session I talked about a month and a half ago, the new Jew, the triangle, the Hebrew labor, Hebrew self-defense, and Hebrew language and culture. That's changed. And, the image that many people have, including what you said, Rabbi, of the machismo Israeli, has changed. Who is a good Israeli, the typical Israeli? Maybe someone who is in intelligence in the military and, is nerdy and sits on a computer all day long, but develops the algorithms that are essential for Iron Dome. And in recent operations, for example, the operators of Iron Dome are the heroes.
Right.
Because they save Israeli lives. And these are not the most elite special force units and the paratrooper brigade and the F-16 pilots. They're the 18, 21-year-old
The
kids.
brains.
Yeah.
So there's a question about Abbas in the government. How is he viewed by Israelis, and how is he doing, and how is he viewed by his Arab constituents?
Well, by virtue of the question, you understand how complicated a situation.
Yeah. Well, this is not my question. It was somebody else's.
He's still there. I mean, I think a lot of people have a lot of respect for him. And me, yours truly included. I would never vote for an Islamist party, of course, but heavily criticized on all sides is the short answer. By the right, by the left, by his landsmen, as they say in Arabic, for selling out to the Zionist devil on the one hand. And the other, I mean, for example, one of the big issues amongst the 20% Arab minority is over the Bedouin in the desert.
Right.
Maybe 250,000, so 15% of all the 2 million Israeli Arabs are Bedouin. And it's a question over Israel recognizing their right to villages, Israel recognizing them and giving them running water and sewage or confiscating land. This is the biggest issue today, actually, in Israel. One of the biggest internal issues is violence. Coming from LA, and I tell you, 100 Israeli Arabs were killed by Israeli Arabs in the past year. 100, that happens, every week in downtown LA. Thankfully not anymore, but it did. That's a lot. That is much more than the rest of Israeli society. And Arab Israelis make up 1/5 of the population. So what's going on there? Well, the Arab population will say it's proof that the Israeli government doesn't care about us. We don't have police enforcement in our towns. The Israeli leadership, Jewish leadership, will say, well, it's proof that you're not willing to follow the laws of Israeli society. So it's crazy. I was had a conversation with someone about this last week. Think of the Black Lives Matter movement. I'm not going into politics, but one of their big issues has to do with defunding the police, right? Your elections this month about defunding police. So you've got a group in American society, African Americans, and those who support them, who say the police have too much money, too much power, and too much control. We've got to defund them and make them more, democratic. In Israel, you have Arab Israelis saying, we've got to increase the funding and the presence of the Israeli police in our cities in order to protect ourselves more. It's the exact opposite reality. It's amazing. And then when you had people in Black Lives Matter marching, and in May and in June marching against Israel and say Palestinian lives matter, I'm like, you guys don't get it. You can't use the paradigm through which you understand American reality and transport that halfway across the world and say, well, Palestinian lives matter. Yes, they do matter, but it's a totally different, worldview. And I think one of the challenges, and somebody asked us last week or the week before, how do we deal with those Israel bashers? Well, that's what we in Judaism believe in, the idea of education. Tzeh ulmad, go out and study. And unfortunately, people love to simplify things. And the only tip I can give, if you have people who are near and dear to you, and you're frustrated having a conversation with them, is saying it's complicated. There's no right or wrong. It's like America. Is a good American, wear red or wear blue? Well, it depends on who you're talking to. And right. Those who wear blue think they're good Americans. Those who wear red think they're good Americans. And the same thing with what's going on in Israel. It's complicated. There are 8 different parties in government. No country in the world, to my knowledge, has a government as diverse as that. Naftali Bennett, the prime minister, wants to build Jewish settlements in the West Bank. Mansour Abbas wants to create better lives for the Arab minority in Israeli society. Avigdor Lieberman on the far right, also wanted to annex the West Bank. I mean, you have nothing as diverse as the Israeli government anywhere in the world. And I think that's a statement about what's happening in Israel that hopefully, we say when we take the Torah out of the ark, Ki mitzion tetzei Torah, out of Zion, out of Jerusalem shall go forth Torah. It's not just the 613 commandments, the 5 books of Moses, it's this whole worldview of ethics and morality. And I think the same too with Israel. We got a lot of challenges, a lot of issues with our neighbors, we got a lot of internal issues, but I'm very positive about this government because, as I said, I think it shows that there are people significant enough in most societies who say, yes, we've got ideological, theological, political differences, but we're going to put those aside to focus on the 90% of issues that we agree on and, work for the betterment of society.
So all these people have been writing, thank you, you're amazing. I would take a trip with you. We love you. We know this isn't the last time. We will be taking a trip with you as soon as trips are, deemed safe, and maybe this this spring, or but soon. And I want to thank you so much on behalf of everyone at Wilshire Boulevard Temple and myself for such an educational and well thought out and beautifully and brilliantly presented series of classes.
Thank you very much, Rabbi, and thank all of you. I can't see you. I mean, there are good things and bad things about being virtual online, and this is one of them. But I hope you've learned a lot. And if anything, I've answered questions, but I've left you with more questions a month and a half after I began this session than you had at the beginning. Then I've done my job. So you might say, it doesn't make any sense. I listened to you for 9 hours, Mike, and I hope that you answer all my questions. And I'm like, no. And that, I think, is the takeaway that I want you to have, and particularly with those who you're in conversation with, and encourage conversation about learning the issues and recognizing the complexities. And as I think it's this week, and correct me or not, Rabbi, we're in Vayishlach, right? The portion where Jacob comes back to the land of Israel.
Yes.
And he meets his brother, and he's very anxious about meeting his brother because, remember, his mother set up.
And he changes his name to Israel.
Well, he doesn't.
His name is changed to Israel, right?
Which, to remind you, and I didn't say this at the beginning, literally means he who struggles with God.
That's right.
And that notion of the struggling with the God of Israel, the people of Israel, the land of Israel, I think that's what makes us.
That's who we are. That's who we are.
And as Shimon Peres, our late president, used to say, when somebody asked him, he said, what's the greatest gift the Jewish people gave the world? And he said, dissatisfaction. Knowing that things are good, but they got to be better. And we got to make.
They could be better.
So
thank you so much, Mike.
Thank you, Rabbi. And I look forward to physical and virtual journeys with all of you in the future.
I agree. Amen. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.